In this special edition of UpFront, we ask, do Muslims and do Muslim-majority countries have a problem with democracy? I'm Mehdi Hassan, and in this special edition of the show on Islam and democracy, I'll speak to experts, to activists, analysts, diplomats from across the Muslim-majority world, from Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Tunisia. Now, the recent announcement by Tunisia's leading quote-unquote Islamist party Ennahda to move away from so-called political Islam has been welcomed by many. But can it really be a model for other Muslim-majority countries trying to find the right balance between faith and democracy? Or is there an irreconcilable tension between secular governance and Sharia law, between liberal values and Islamic beliefs? That's our debate today. I'm joined in this special UpFront show by Shadi Hamid, a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, and author of the new book Islamic Exceptionalism: How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. Hussein Haqqani, senior fellow and director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute and former Pakistani ambassador to the United States. Sumaya Ghanouchi, a British-Tunisian writer, analyst and member of the Ennahda party, co-founded by her father, Rashid Ghanouchi. And Mona El-Tahawi, an Egyptian-American writer, commentator, author and activist. We'll also be joined later in the show by the Turkish journalist Mustafa Akyol. Shadi Hamid, let me begin by asking you, you've got a new book out called Islamic Exceptionalism. Many would say that the exceptionalism of the Islamic world, the Muslim-majority world, is that it's not a place that welcomes democracy. It's not a place that's comfortable with democracy. Is that fair?
That's definitely not accurate in the sense that there are Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Pakistan, which are at least somewhat democratic and somewhat successful. The bigger issue is whether Islam is compatible with secular democracy or liberal democracy, and I think that's where there is real tension. Islam does seem to be, at least so far in history, to be uniquely resistant to secularization. Islam continues to play an outsized role in public life and politics throughout the Muslim world, not just in the Middle East, but also in places like Pakistan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And what's actually really interesting, I think, is that the more democracy you have, like take Indonesia or Malaysia, for example, you actually see Islam playing in some ways a greater role, that you have more Sharia ordinances on the local level in those two countries than in much of the Middle East, say Tunisia, Egypt, or Turkey.
Well, Hussein Haqqani, you were the ambassador of a country that is one of the world's biggest Muslim-majority nations. It calls itself the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and yet for around half of its existence, it's been under military rule. How much is this outsized Islam that Shadi refers to responsible for some of that lack of democracy?
Well, first of all, let us understand what we are talking about. Democracy is actually a way of thinking. So when Shadi says that, there can be some form of democracy that's not liberal, I don't understand that. Because very frankly, democracy cannot just be the majority voting somebody into power and then that person imposing laws which he or she says come from God and therefore they cannot be changed. So what is really the problem in the Muslim world is that while the West was evolving new forms of politics over the last few centuries, we were stagnant, the Muslims were stagnant, and then we came under colonial rule. And after colonialism, we are divided between those who want to imitate the West and those who say we need to go back to Islam. Now, there are people, and I would say that, for example, Ennahda in Tunisia is an example of somebody saying, no, we need to move forward with Islam. And that would make room for real democracy. What has happened in Pakistan is the military basically has tried to build a nation which did not exist. Egypt has been there for 5,000 years. There is a Tunisia. Pakistan was carved out of British India and it needed an identity, and Islam was used to provide that identity. So Pakistani Islamism is rather different from Islamism in other countries.
Well, you mentioned Ennahda. Sumaya Ghanouchi, your party Ennahda won a lot of praise for helping Tunisia transition from dictatorship to democracy without implementing God's laws, as Hussein mentions, for helping draft a relatively secular constitution, handing over power to a government of technocrats, And yet, after all of that, you weren't rewarded by Tunisians. You lost the 2014 parliamentary elections. Is there a long-term future for Islamic or quote-unquote Islamist parties, such as your own, in a relatively secular democratic country like Tunisia, in an increasingly secular democratic world?
Well, you say we lost the elections, but we're back to being the largest bloc in parliament. I think when you talk, about the constitution being secular, I'm not too comfortable with these terms, secular and Islamist. They're very ambiguous, very controversial, and really ideologically loaded. And when you talk about democracy, I think, and Islam, and the issue of their compatibility or incompatibility, I think you need to define what you understand by Islam and what you understand by democracy. To me, democracy is a set of mechanisms that help rationalize the political sphere. And Islam, like any great religion, has been and is still subject to many interpretations. There are open, flexible interpretations, and there are extreme and closed interpretations. And if you adopt the former, the more open interpretation, you can find a common ground between Islam and democracy.
Just before I leave you and go to the next panelist, just very quickly, you say Islamist and secular loaded words, and I don't disagree with you. They're often used by people like me as shorthand. How would you describe Ennahda?
I would describe Ennahda as a democratic party with an Islamic reference. It's a more liberal Islamic democratic party.
Mona El-Tahawi, the experience in your country, Egypt, has been very different to that of Tunisia. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood period in power was a bit of a disaster, many would say. Ended in a brutal military coup, the banning of the Brotherhood. You were a critic of the Brotherhood, just as you are a critic of the Sisi government today. Would you accept that Tunisia's experience shows parties with an Islamic reference can compromise, can govern effectively, can share power?
I reject the role of religion in any system of politics around the world, whether it's my own country, Egypt, or the United States, where I lived for 13 years, or I was in Jerusalem as a Reuters correspondent, and I noticed the role that Jewish parties played in that country's disastrous politics as well. So I reject the role of religion. I am secular, and I'm a proud secular Muslim, and I use both terms together because I think that there's too much resistance to the two terms together. And by secular Muslim, I mean that in my life, I'm a Muslim. But in my public and political life, I am secular.
But Mona, just to be clear, when you say you don't, secular Islam in private, not in public, just to be clear, you mentioned also the United States. Would you accept that in the West, democracy has been informed by its quote-unquote Judeo-Christian heritage? That is part of the history and culture here. So why shouldn't, in Muslim-majority countries, Islam at least inform the principles or the values of governance? Or should it have no role whatsoever?
Yeah, well, I think it shouldn't, because I think we should learn from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we should aspire to be better. Because as I said, when I was in Jerusalem, I saw the role that Jewish political parties play in Israel's politics. And I've seen here in the United States just how toxic the dialogue has been. I mean, I just follow the geopolitical debates every month. They are determined to turn the United States into a Christian country. And as an Egyptian American, I thoroughly reject what I call Christian politics, and as I do Islamic politics in Egypt. I want a politics that is like a room with a ceiling that is as high as possible. And the higher that ceiling, the more people can stand under that ceiling. The more religion plays a role, the lower that ceiling becomes, especially for women, especially for sexual minorities.
Okay, let me...
For minorities.
So Mona says she wants to put the ceiling as high as possible, and that means keeping religion out of the public space.
Well, religion can be a foster for tolerance and for openness, and so can secularism. I mean, secularism hasn't always been a foster for tolerance and for openness. After all, Stalin and Hitler were secularists. So again, you really have... I think it's when you talk about secularism, there is an interventionist form of secularism as well, a top-down secularism, which was implemented in Turkey, for instance, and in Tunisia. Secularism can be despotic, and so can religion.
Shadi, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I'm sure. So, I mean, democracy is fundamentally about being responsive to the voting public. And most of these societies in the Middle East, voters want Islam to play a significant role in public life. And they can disagree on what that means exactly, but this is very clear. So if you're telling the majority in Egypt, Jordan, or Tunisia, sorry, we're going to exclude religion and privatize religion, that is actually counter to the essence of democracy. And that's why it's extremely important to find a way to incorporate those citizens. We don't have to like it. We don't have to like Islamists. We can be very uncomfortable with them. But democracy is democracy, and we have to respect that.
That's an incorrect characterization of what the Islamists want. The Islamists say that we are the custodians of God's law. Read all Islamist literature. And by the way, you must remember that until the age of 19, I was an Islamist myself. So there is one thing, which is acceptance of people's religiosity as an integral part of society. And it is quite another to start saying that theologians will invoke historic interpretations of faith and then insist that that will constitute the boundary for legislation.
But let me just put a point to you,
But
Mona.
I want to address both Egypt and Shadi's point about this idea that if this is what people want, we have to give it to them. If I look at, a state in the United States like Alabama, which is known to be very conservative, very southern, and often, maybe unfairly, but probably quite rightly, very racist and bigoted. If I were to take a poll in the state of Alabama and ask them, how many of you would approve of building a mosque, say? So now this is probably a majority Christian state. I am sure many people, a shockingly high number, would say, no, don't. And so this idea that just because the majority wants something, it's okay, we have to be really careful. We cannot have, one of the tenets of the United States is this idea of the tyranny of the majority. We cannot allow the majority to tyrannize the rest of us, which is why I keep saying that when religion is involved in any country, the people who end up suffering are women, sexual minorities, and religious minorities.
Mona, let me put that point to Sumaya. Sumaya, Mona says not just she doesn't trust clerics, but what do you do when there's a tyranny of the majority, even if it's a religious majority? How can you simply say, well, we've won an election, therefore we have legitimacy?
Well, in Tunisia, what is characteristic about the Tunisian experience is that Ennahda, for instance, has completely steered clear of the logic of majority versus minority. I mean, Ennahda in 2011, after the revolution, when it won the elections, it declared that it was not interested in ruling alone, that it would not follow the logic of majority versus minority, and that it wanted to build coalitions with other forces, whoever was willing to work with it, and it forged a coalition with two other secularist and again we go back to that term, nationalist and liberal parties. In fact, this was the logic Ennahda followed even when it was in the opposition.
But here's a question to you before I bring back in our guests here. So my one quick question, is that logic of Ennahda's, and it's been praised for, not bringing in hudud punishments like stoning or flogging or trying to ban alcohol. But have you rejected those kind of laws because you no longer think they're valid in the 21st century in a democracy? Or have you rejected them because you simply don't have popular support for them yet?
No. If you look at another literature, and I'm well acquainted with it, you won't find the term Sharia anywhere.
Okay, so you wouldn't bring in a penal code that involved stoning or flogging under any circumstances?
No, I mean, as I said, if you look at another literature, since its founding in 1981, you would not find a single mention of the term Sharia. And as I said, there was a controversy around the inclusion of Sharia as a source of legislation in the Constitution, with one camp endorsing the Sharia camp endorsing its inclusion, and another camp endorsing the inclusion of secularism. And another opposed the inclusion of Sharia, saying that it's enough to say that Tunisia is a Muslim country.
Shadi.
Yeah, so of course majorities are constrained by constitutions. But even in the case of the US, if you have a large enough supermajority, they can override constitutional protections and amend the Constitution. And that's why we had prohibition in this country, in the US, many decades ago, because you had 75% of the states and 2/3 of both houses of Congress that believed that, right? So in Alabama, the state assembly can restrict abortion. I don't like those things, but we have to respect that if Alabamans want to do that, They have the right to do that. But
Shadi,
I'll
the
just say,
American Constitution came before American democracy.
Okay.
Let's understand that. Whereas in the Muslim world, what we are going is we are going from authoritarian rule to some form of
Shadi finish
government.
his point, and then I'm going to Mona.
One more thing on this. I mean, the American or say French constitutions are products of an Enlightenment tradition.
Right.
Islam is not necessarily the same religion as Christianity. I hate to state the obvious, but why do we always assume that Islam has to follow the exact same trajectory?
But we should
as
have an enlightenment. Are you against an enlightenment?
Christianity has no equivalent of Islamic law. Islamic law is a different kind of thing. In the founding moment of Christianity, Jesus was not coming with a model of governance or saying that Christian law should govern the early Christian state.
Do you think there's a contradiction between having Islamic law, however you define that, with respect to Sumaya, and democracy?
No, but there is a contradiction between Islamic law, perhaps, and liberal democracy. Democracy is not the same thing as liberal democracy. Liberalism
What
and
is the other
democracy can
democracy?
be in tension.
Mona,
democracy?
Shadi's saying democracy is not the same thing as liberal democracy. You could have democracy and Islamic law together.
Well, I disagree. What's missing from our discussion is the idea of rights. The idea of rights, not just democracy. What kind of right do I have as a? What kind of right do I have as a sexual minority? What kind of right do I have as someone who's not a Muslim, whether I left Islam or I'm a Christian or any other kind of religion? So I think that in order to talk about liberal or non, there is no non-liberal democracy. You can't talk about non-liberal democracies. Democracies by nature have to be liberal if you talk about liberalism.
Thank you, Mona, for taking part in the discussion. Now, to get the perspective from Turkey, we're joined from Istanbul by columnist Mustafa Akyol, author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. Mustafa, there was a time when Turkey was considered to be the Muslim democratic model. You yourself at one stage seemed to be suggesting that the AK party in Turkey, what many describe as an Islamist party, had found a way to combine Islamic norms and classical liberalism, market economy, democracy. Today, Turkey, of course, looks like a very illiberal democracy from afar, with President Erdogan looking very much to his critics like a dictator in waiting. You would accept Turkey is no longer that model any longer?
Yes, I was a big defender of the Turkish model, and I'm among the people who are disappointed now. The Turkish model failed, and AK Party growingly became authoritarian, not because of Sharia-related issues, though. In today, the issue is not that whether AKP will bring Sharia or impose Islamic norms on society. There are some discussions about public life. But what happened in Turkey is that through democratization, AK Party grabbed power, immense power, and that power corrupted and tempted and intoxicated the people who grabbed it. So we are seeing a very growingly authoritarian way of governance with problems like curbing freedom of the press, silencing opposition, not allowing tolerance, not allowing criticism, not tolerating criticism. So these are not problems that are directly coming from Islam. These are problems coming from power. These are problems we see in Russia as well. And Russia is not doesn't have a problem with Sharia, or that's not the issue there.
So illiberal democracy is a reality. We don't have to like these things, but if that's what democracy produces, that's what democracy produces. And it's not just in the Middle East. Hungary and Poland have elected illiberal parties. And we actually here in the US, I should say, may very well decide to elect our first illiberal Democrat as president. His name is Donald Trump. That scares me very much as a minority in America. But if Donald Trump wins, I will respect that outcome and he will be the legitimate president. That's how democracy works.
These are two different things, Shadi. One is whether it's legitimate if somebody who's illiberal gets elected through liberal means. But my point is something bigger, which is that there should be constitutional constraints. And what the Islamists want is the erosion of those constitutional constraints.
Sumaya, I just want to ask you one question about Ennahda being a party with an Islamic reference, but doesn't impose its Islam on the people. But here's what I don't get. What is the point of being an Islamic party if you're not going to, not impose, but try and bring about Islamic change in society? How are you any different to any other party if you dilute your Islamic identity so much that you're no different to any other non-Islamic party?
What I understand by Islam is a value system, a system of spirituality and morality, of norms that provide society with balance for individuals and for communities. I understand Islam as a source of great ideals, the ideal of justice, the ideal of freedom, the ideal of the need for the protection of human life. And as such, I see no tension between these Islamic values and human values, and as such we can see a strong common ground between the two.
You can extract political values from Islam, like search for justice, rule of law, transparency, and you can argue for these. You can work for the common good based on your values that is coming from Islam. One more thing, if I may add, I think this whole idea of more liberalism, enlightenment in the Muslim world, there's a conundrum that we're living in the past 2 centuries. These ideas are coming to the Muslim world from where? From the West. But the West is also the root of the anger, the target of the anger, because of imperialism, because of Israel-Palestine, because of all of that. So you see anti-Western sentiments easily becoming anti-liberal, becoming very authoritarian, and you have this kind of vicious cycle. So this should not be a conundrum that the Muslims should be trapped in. They can criticize the West for political reasons, still admire political values that have flourished in the West before our civilization.
Well, can I make a point in response to Mustafa? I mean, we hear so much criticism of Turkey these days, of the political system in Turkey, and whatever reservations one might have to the political system in Turkey. I mean, if you look around the region with its dictators and generals, with their record of rigged elections and repression, and some of whom have never bothered with elections or parliaments, I think Turkey looks very well. Yet the criticism is heaped on Turkey rather than on the other real dictatorships around the region, some of which have never had elections.
The role of outside powers really has to be emphasized here, because democracy has to have a chance to play out. So look, as bad as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was and as lousy as Morsi was, they were only governing for a year, and then the process was aborted. So we have to be very careful about making sweeping conclusions when it never actually has a chance to proceed. And this is where, as an American, I think it's really unfortunate that we have a pretty tragic history as Americans in supporting autocratic regimes. We supported the military coup in Egypt. And this is where I think we have to look inward and say, well, we talk a lot about democracy, but in practice, we don't actually support it. Islamist parties are the ones that are most likely to win in elections in the Middle East. We have to get over that.
What do you think the Muslim majority world's experiment with democracy is going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from now, Mustafa? Throwing forward rather than looking back.
It will be complicated. We haven't gone through an enlightenment yet, as Shadi rightly pointed out. We need that kind of thought as well to make our democracies not authoritarian, but more liberal democracies.
Well, I think I'll just make a small point saying whatever the future of these democratic experiments in the region, what is certain is that dictatorship and despotism have no future in this region.
Okay, Shadi?
Yeah, we just make a broader point that we hear this so much in our public discourse that Islam has to go through a reformation. Islam has to be secularized and privatized and all these things. And I think it's very patronizing that Muslims have to be taught how to practice their religion. What if Muslims don't want to be secularized? So I think the message there is we, Americans in particular, have to accept that Islam is going to play an important role in the Middle East. And I would also just emphasize that for the better part of 14 centuries in Islamic history and in Islamic tradition, Islam has imbued everyday life in a very powerful way. So you can't just say, well, those 14 centuries are irrelevant. And there's also a prophetic model. Prophet Muhammad intertwined religious and political functions. So if you're a secularist and you're saying that Islam should be secular, you're essentially arguing against a prophetic model. You can do that, but it's kind of a hard sell.
Hussein, briefly, we're almost out of time.
Again, that's what I call the shall we say, a particularized version of history. The truth of the matter is that the word dola or state doesn't appear in Quran. As far as the future is concerned, we have to build the future. The future will have to be constructed. And if we construct it along a democratic path, retaining our Islamic traditions,
hopefully it'll be constructed through debates like this. We're out of time. Thank you all for joining me. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.